people constantly have in their mind an idea that there's how you're supposed to register to vote, where you're supposed to be voting. And this comes up over and over again about college students, about people who are doing something sneaky about domicile for tax purposes because they want to use their homestead exemption one place or another. And it comes up and there's this sense that what they're doing is sort of illegitimate or sneaky or something. And what people miss is this fundamental idea about the law, that the law speaks to voters and the public and ordinary citizens in only one way. It speaks through the criminal law. So when you talk about a duty to do something, if you were a judge or a city council member or an employee of a municipal government, you have duties to do things. And if you violate those duties, there are legal consequences. For example, you could be discharged, or you could be fined, or you could be ordered to do something. But if you're a citizen, the only way the law speaks to you is through the criminal law. And the question is, what could you be charged with criminally? So when people start off and they ask, where am I supposed to register? Or say, that person is supposed to register at such and such an address, their college town, or where their parents live, or where they spend the greater part of their time, or the place to which they ordinarily return. All of these phrases are sort of in state law. They're wrong, because if you look at the criminal law and you ask who is ever prosecuted for registering to vote at a different address, the standards are very weak, and a person basically chooses where they want to register to vote. You've got to have a certain amount of contact with that place, and if you've got it, you can register there and you can keep your registration. Okay? So now let's talk about those things. Really, there are two things that you got to do, and these are sort of what we lawyers call terms of art. You've got to have a physical presence. Once, right? You have to have that physical presence. So you have to be there, and I suppose you have to spend the night or something. It has to be a place that, you could reside in an ordinary sense. Let's say, not like a restaurant booth. You go in and have a meal. You probably can't register to vote there. But if you spend the night in the restaurant, I think you can register to vote there. So you have to have that first, the physical presence, and then you have to have some sort of continuing relationship to it, which isn't even the right to continue living there, but some idea that, that you have some right to come back, or you could have some right, or you have some idea that you could. And so if you register to vote in that restaurant, that's a really good example, because it's the most extreme one I can think. You sneak into a restaurant, you stay there overnight, and you go and register to vote at the city clerk's office the next day. And then you go find some other place to live. Once you have established the right to register to vote in a place, and you have registered there, you've effectively declared that to be your domicile. You don't give that up until you intend to give it up. And that's also kind of a complicated notion. And what that really means is, once you register to vote someplace, until you do something inconsistent with it, like registering somewhere else, you can keep it. When Gerald Ford was president, people sued because he went away to Washington, was in Congress first, and then his boyhood, the home where he was registered to vote, was sold, and then it was demolished, and then it was replaced by a different building, so that eventually not even the address existed. There was nothing there but part of a much larger building. And it was still okay for him to be registered there. Different law in that case, because of the law involving domiciliaries who were in Washington, D.C. as elected officials. But still, he could point to that and say, I had a physical presence there, I have as much right as anybody to still be there, and I've not re-registered someplace else, so I'm still a registered voter in Michigan at that, now non-existent house. Now, whenever this is contested, see, you finally have to determine what the boundaries are, how far you can go with voter registration, by asking, when do people get prosecuted? How far do you have to go to actually be charged criminally and convicted of doing this? And the answer is, by the way, almost no one ever is. I mean, I can't actually think of a case where a person had such a presence and then didn't re-register and was somehow convicted later. I mean, no matter how outrageous the position is. And there's no method, by the way, for a city clerk or a township clerk to remove you from the rolls merely because your voter registration is outrageous. They're only allowed to send notices to the place and then wait for them to be returned. And if you keep voting there, I don't know how they have any ability to stop you. They just keep, sending notices, and maybe they send you a letter eventually, but you just ignore them. Now, the context in which eventually there's a determination whether you have this intention to return only appears at the time that there's some sort of a proceeding to remove you from the rolls or to order you to stop doing it. And at that point, you see, it's easy to say, well, I intend to return there. You don't have to have filed a piece of paper in advance. You don't have to have figured this out. You can wait till the lawyer tells you that that's what you're supposed to say. And so everybody always has the right intention because the intention is only determined at the point that they're trying to wipe it out, right? And so this is kind of like everybody has remorse at sentencing in a criminal case because after all, lawyers told him you're supposed to read this statement and say you have remorse. Well, in a voter registration situation, you have to say, I've always intended to return there. And someone says to Gerald Ford, but there's no building, there's no address, you can't. Well, he still intends to. I don't know what that means, it doesn't mean anything. But this is determined by the criminal law. And the criminal law gives all the presumptions to the citizen. And that's why I'm saying this idea that there's a duty to register to vote or to be registered in a particular place is just wrong. You have to have a physical presence that may be brief, and you have to be willing to say you have an intention to return, and you have to not do something inconsistent. Because at the point you are, say, charged criminally with illegal voting, if you have also registered to vote someplace else, now you've effectively declared that that's your new domicile, that you've moved, you've changed your intention, you see. But if you haven't done that, you're home free. Now, you might think that a homeless person would have trouble registering to vote, but in Michigan, and I think in most states, it's actually very easy for a homeless person to register to vote. They don't have to have you don't have to live somewhere that has mail service or that's official, or that the city approves someone living there under the building code or the rental license code or something like that. You can register to vote anywhere you have a physical presence and you're willing to say you have an intention to return. That's all you need. Now, the city will be puzzled if you register to vote, say, at a bridge, underneath a bridge, right? But if you list the location, they'll talk to the city attorney, who will be puzzled and will look into it and will finally conclude that you can register to vote under a bridge. Now, it's easier to register to vote at a homeless shelter or a friend's house. If you've stayed at a friend's house once until they kick you out and they tell you never to come back and they call the police if they see you again, that's still fine. You can register to vote there because you had a physical presence and you say you have the intention to return. So we've met all the standards. You could register to vote at a location which doesn't have mail service, a park or under a bridge or whatever. Again, that's difficult, but it's not impossible. I think that you could register to vote at a jail because you had a physical presence and you have an intention to return, which you probably should, somewhat underplay when you explain this to the judge, but you intend to return and you always feel like you're welcome there. And the easiest way, though, is some sort of social services agency where, you spent the night. Now, in Michigan, you actually have a right to 2 addresses. And people don't understand this. You have a physical address, which is your location, your domicile, your location that you claim as your home. But then you have a mailing address, which doesn't have to have any connection to it at all. And that certainly could be, a homeless agency, right? As long as somebody's willing to handle your mail for you. And so it's nice to have something like that the mail can actually deliver it. Because if you try to deliver it to the 127 overpass at Michigan Avenue, which has a nice little ledge, if you try to have mail delivered there, the mail will simply refuse to deliver it because the post office doesn't recognize that as being part of a carrier route. And so it will be instantly rejected when they try to mail it there. There's just no address. There's no mailbox. The post office doesn't have your system. So you could register to vote at the 127 overpass with your mail to be sent to Loaves and Fishes in downtown Lansing. Okay, that works just fine. But your voting, it's not just that you're registered to vote, you're also in districts. Your district will be the place that is determined by your physical location, as say the 127 overpass, which will, by the way, be very difficult for them because they won't really know which precinct it's in. They'd have to probably send out a survey team to figure it out, but that's not your problem. So anyway, it's very easy for homeless people to register and to vote. The real problem with homeless people is that they're fairly difficult to work with and they don't follow instructions very closely. And they often have other problems in their lives which take precedence over, their own education on matters of civic importance. Yes. I assume that in your place up north, you've actually spent the night there. I assume that, you could at least say that you've slept in your office at some point. You should. It's probably a good thing to sleep in your office one time if you're going to register to vote there. And certainly you're home. Now the trick is that it might interact with your principal residence for the purpose of homestead tax exemption. And this wouldn't be a problem about voting. Nobody would complain you're voting in the wrong place. But the state is likely to go after your homestead tax exemption. This, by the way, comes up in other places. Just this idea that you have to register to vote where your driver's license is. That's not true. You can register to vote in any location you have a right to register. But the Secretary of State has the right to change your driver's license to match wherever you've registered to vote. It's the inverse of what people believe. So you're unconstrained as to where you register, but you just have to expect that other people, the tax authorities, driver's license, the motor vehicle office, they have a right to make your other records consistent with your declaration that you intend always for your home to be, the 127 overpass or your place up north. There really isn't an official declaration anywhere else, I guess. You fill out a form and they ask you for addresses. But for example, when you apply for a driver's license, I don't know that anybody is really asking you. I don't think that when you get a driver's license that you're required to put down a domicile. I think that that's simply an address you're listing is for contact by mail. I've never really thought about it, but I don't think that there's any problem in the case of a driver's license listing an address where you have, for example, no continuing right to be there and you've never had physical presence. I just don't think there's a problem. If you want to list your mother's address and you haven't stayed at your mother's place since she bought the house, I think that's perfectly all right for a driver's license. I mean, I say that without having really looked into motor vehicle law, but I'm not aware of anyone who's ever been prosecuted or charged or even hassled for having listed an address where they don't have a physical right to be present and they have not had a physical presence. But so I think you're right. I think that as far as voting is a declaration of domicile, and there just isn't much else for an ordinary citizen where they are required to declare a domicile. It might be true for passport purposes. It might be true if you are an employee or an officer, for example. If you're elected to the city council, run for city council, I imagine you have to declare where you live, right? Because you have to be a resident of the city of East Lansing to run for East Lansing City Council. But if you're simply a driver and you list an address in East Lansing, which isn't really your address, it's somebody else's, I don't know that you've committed any kind of fraud. I suppose, might involve insurance fraud if there were different rates, but that's really a question involving whether you're doing it for a purpose of defrauding someone. If it's merely that you have some strange idea that you'd like to list an odd address where people will hold your mail for you, I don't think there's any requirement for anything other than voting to list an address that would qualify as a domicile. There are so many incorrect ideas about voter registration, and one of them is that in 1999 and 2000, that Mike Rogers, when he was a state senator, pushed through the legislature a bill that people think required students to register to vote only at their hometown and prevented them from registering in college towns. Now, that's just completely incorrect. It's just completely incorrect. The bill that was adopted, which wasn't exactly what was originally introduced, it was changed in a bunch of ways to make it constitutional, and to clean up its inconsistencies, requires the inverse of what people think. You can register to vote anywhere you want to register to vote. The amendment that was adopted, that Rogers pushed through, was not an amendment to MCL 168, which is the election code. It was an amendment to the motor vehicle code, because in Michigan you can only amend one section of law. And he amended the chapter on driving, not the chapter on voting. And so what he did was he created in the Secretary of State a power that if you register to vote somewhere, they can change your driver's license to match. There's no restriction whatever on where you register to vote in that statute. Now, you would expect then that at least this would create some problems for people because they don't want their driver's license, say, on the MSU campus. But it turns out actually to be fairly harmless, because it turns out that all they do is they send you an address correction sticker to put on the back of your license, and there's no legal requirement to apply it. And I've never heard of a person who was hassled for failing to apply it. And so you can just ignore it. It means, though, that notices sent by the Secretary of State are likely to be mailed to your college address, if you were ever mailed anything based on your driver's license address. Even that can be controlled, though, because if you're knowledgeable, you have a right to 2 addresses in Michigan election law. And as a result of this, because there's really only one data file, you see, that's the secret underneath it all. The driver's license and the voter registration system share a database. And so the addresses you list for one become the addresses you list for the other, because they don't have any place to put different addresses. That's the real reason that the Secretary of State wanted to push it through. So you have a right to an address where you are voting and which you declared your domicile, and you have a right to an address where you want your mail sent. And there's no reason you can't have your mail sent, for example, to your parents' address. So that's what we always suggest people do. Now, the result of this misunderstanding has been that at least when we're effective on the MSU campus, I would say that we have achieved a partial consensus that everyone in East Lansing agrees that Republican students should register to vote where their parents live, or not register at all. But they shouldn't register to vote in college towns. And then it's only as to the Democrats that we disagree. We tell the Democrats to register to vote in East Lansing, and the Republicans tell them to register to vote somewhere else. And so we've usually won that argument with them. We explain that to the Democrats, that's right, the Republicans tell you should register to vote somewhere else. The result of this is that all this confusion has cut the number of voters on campus, but has allowed us to run up huge percentage margins. So as how it's actually affected East Lansing and Ingham County politics, it's hard to tell, but I don't think it's hurt us any. The reason that urban myths take hold is not because somebody said something malicious in the first place. It's because they just seem true. And so as soon as somebody says something that seems true, it gets passed along and picks up speed and becomes understood by everybody. So there are a bunch of myths about changing your voter registration to East Lansing, that it will cause you to lose your insurance, auto insurance or health insurance. Not true. We've never found a case. We've asked for years. No one can tell us a particular person. And we've really looked around for it. We've just never found it. Or you'll lose your scholarship. Or it'll have some tax consequences. Or it'll prevent you from something. None of these things turn out to be true with one fascinating exception. Now, I haven't heard of this recently, but I believe that there is a specific scholarship given by the state of Pennsylvania. And the scholarship, which can be used in out-of-state universities, including Michigan State, it by its terms, probably under Pennsylvania law, it is rescinded if they are informed you've registered to vote outside Pennsylvania. But it's not really a problem because Pennsylvania tells the 4 of them who show up at MSU with a scholarship, don't register to vote there because if you do, we will cancel your scholarship. And so these 4 or so people would walk around the campus and tell everyone very clearly, no, I have been informed in writing that I can't register to vote here. I'm sorry, I cannot register to vote in East Lansing. I'm required to keep my Pennsylvania registration. And I think that's about it. Other than that, so 99.99% of all the students at MSU should just ignore all this, unless they're Republicans, in which case they should believe it. Well, in the first place, I want to talk about the history of voter registration law. Until 1996, Michigan law required that voter registration be nonpartisan. And a person who was registering voters was appointed by the local clerk and sworn into office as a nonpartisan agent. So you could be a Democrat or you could be a Republican, but you couldn't campaign while registering voters. And no candidate could register voters. And when you registered voters, you had to do it without any reference to political party. That idea continues, even though it's completely false. Because beginning in 1996, what was known as the federal motor voter law took effect, which created the federal mail-in voter form. And the federal mail-in voter form is not circulated by a nonpartisan official who is sworn an oath of office to follow the laws of the state of Michigan and to not be partisan. The federal law can be carried door to door by Malaysian pirates. It can be carried door to door by children. It can be carried door to door, and you can fill it out in the presence of a trained chimpanzee. There's no requirement. You could fill out a voter registration form at gunpoint. I don't recommend this. I'm not saying that voter registration, I suppose the Second Amendment nuts will disagree with me, and they would probably be in favor of using guns, but maybe I ought to ask them. Anyway, if you coerce somebody using a gun and registered voters, now they probably have the right to rescind it because it's done under coercion, but if they ratify it, it's still a perfectly valid voter registration form. In other words, there are no standards. And so beginning in 1996, candidates can register voters while they're canvassing for themselves. And this is the thing that those of us who go back before 96 just find unbelievable. A person comes up to you and says, I'd like to register to vote. And you say, no, you're a Republican. I won't do it. You have every right to. You know, it's now a partisan activity in Michigan because the federal law trumped Michigan law. Now, there's an interesting little coda to this, a little side note. And that is that last year, the Republicans in the legislature pushed through some reforms of voter registration in which they attempted to create all sorts of additional new requirements for voter registration drives. Those were illegal. There's now been a federal court decision on a major point which says they simply can't do that. Because the federal law, it's very, very simple. The federal law says that the state and the municipalities shall accept the mail-in form. And the only words that address this are the words, quote, shall accept, close quote. There are no restrictions on it. There's no definition. There are no procedures. The only thing it says is they shall accept. And the state attempted to create, the Republicans in the legislature attempted to create all of these hurdles and barriers and requirements and criminal penalties for people going door to door and doing various things. And my intention was to send to the Elections Bureau, the people I know there quite well, I was going to send them a note that said, I intend to ignore the law. I intend to register voters on the MSU campus. I'm informing you of this right now so you can seek equitable relief in the courts. And I intend to defy the law because I don't think that you'll win. And my plan was thwarted when Snyder vetoed the law. And so we just don't have it. Anyway, we almost had a requirement, which would have been unconstitutional, that there be additional requirements about how you register voters. You still could have been partisan, but there were a bunch of things that were going to require. Anyway, you don't. So if there's a 9-year-old child with a gun going door to door and drinking while he does it, okay, and he collects voter registration forms, they're okay. There's no problem with it, okay? My experience is limited really to the MSU campus because we can never seem to get anybody else in any other campus to follow our instructions or to believe what we're doing. And so they are all trapped doing very ineffective voter drives. So MSU has an extremely effective voter drive, at least most years. Sometimes we fall down, but usually we have very effective voter drives. We turn in sometimes 90% or 85% of all the forms that are turned into the city clerk between, say, August 25th and the close of voter registration, roughly October 10th, before each election. Sometimes 85% of those forms have been turned in by East Lansing progressives. And the other 15% are divided among walk-ins at City Hall, voter registrations received at Secretary of State branch office, lots of stupid, ineffective little drives, and MSU's very sincere, very badly conducted official university voter drive. All of them put together produce maybe 300 forms to our 2,000 or 3,000. So it really is true that if you do it right, you can do it right, and if you just are a muddled mess, you do it very badly. Okay. So as long as we're the only people registering voters, we can run up the partisan Democratic percentage to very high rates, 80, 85%. We're not perfect at determining people's partisanship, but we try to determine partisanship before offering them voter forms. But everybody else tends to come onto the campus and feel like they're do-gooders, like this isn't really fair, like it's the good old days of nonpartisan voter drives. And so, for example, the Obama campaign, both in 2008 and in 2012, came onto the campus and tried to register voters. Now, the effect of a table that is associated with one of the campaigns is that most of the people whom they register are typically people sympathetic to them. And so the Republican table, if it ever registered any voters, very often the Republicans turn in numbers like 12 forms in the entire year. But if the Republicans turn in forms that they've collected, they're predominantly Republican forms. They're predominantly Republicans. And certainly the Obama campaign tended to attract Democrats. But the problem, especially in 2008, was that on the campus, we had removed so many of the Democratic potential registrants. The remaining Democrats had largely decided not to register to vote in East Lansing because they had some particular tie back home. They wanted to vote, in some local elections or whatever their reason was. So that the Democrats had actually made the decision. Either they registered in East Lansing or they refused to register. And so most of the people wandering around the campus who might register or might not, who would register if we just gave them a chance, most of them were Republicans. And so it was easier to register Republicans door to door than Democrats. Even though Democrats were the predominant group, even though it was the Obama campaign. And so the Obama campaign raised the number of voter registrations in East Lansing by a substantial number, by their blind, by which I don't mean they couldn't see, but rather their they didn't look, they were neutral. By using blind techniques, they tended to increase the number of voters by several thousand, and they tended to water down our percentages. My guess is that in the end, it didn't hurt Obama, that even though he probably registered a much more Republican group than we registered, because he increased the total numbers, the percentage went down, the numbers went up, and his overall margin in East Lansing probably remained about the same, or he even increased it slightly. So it didn't really hurt things. But it is just infuriating to me that we go through, and after 2 or 3 good years, we can get it so that, say, 60% of the Democrats on campus are registered to vote in East Lansing, and 5% of the Republicans are, right? And then along comes somebody and they sort of just, I don't know, trample in our flower garden, you know, our flower bed, and leave footprints and broken bulbs. Well, I don't know that I do it. I think we do it. But there are so many activities in life where doing it right and doing it wrong are very similar looking. And it has to do with the motivation of the people and the training and the degree of management control. I mean, I just think, imagine a good restaurant and a bad restaurant. You know, you can run a pretty bad restaurant and have it look just like the good restaurant. You can have employees and a payroll and china and order food. And if the cook doesn't really care and the manager doesn't really care and you don't really like your clients, you can have a pretty bad reputation for a restaurant pretty fast, right? You just save a little money here and you save a little money there, and you know, it looks the same, but the place across the street has a great reputation because the manager would fire a cook who did that, because the cook has pride in her work, and so on. With voter registration, it's the same sort of thing. If your motivation isn't really good, if it isn't to try to register voters efficiently, and especially voters who are sympathetic to you, and you're not trying to get the largest possible number, but instead you're kind of going through the motions like the bad restaurant, there are a lot of ways to do it wrong. One of the best ways to do it wrong is to assume that the people who you want to register to vote are the ones who are already motivated to register to vote. And so you just set up a table someplace and wait for them to go out of their way and walk several hundred feet and come over to the table and ask you how to register to vote. And you know, they assume they have to produce ID, they assume they have to know all these things, they should know what the law is, they've been told they can't register unless they do this or that, or they don't know. And you just sit there and you wait for people to decide, unlike all the people walking next to them, to break out of line. They're on their way to the cafeteria, they're maybe in the building, and you've set up a table next to the cafeteria line, and they should leave their place in line and come over and register to vote. Now, if you do that, and you offer everybody on the MSU campus a chance to register to vote, and you set up tables everywhere, say in a non-presidential year. Presidential year, there's a little bit of magnetism because people want to participate. But in a gubernatorial year or a city council year, an odd-numbered year, and you set up such tables, you can register to vote 100 or 200 people out of 40,000. See? And that's what happens. That's what you get. MSU, bless their heart, finally adopted a resolution in the mid-90s that said that MSU is now in favor of students voting in East Lansing. They don't remember they did that, but they actually adopted such a resolution. And that the trustees and the administration are in favor of voting. And so the bureaucrats at MSU include a voter registration form with a lot of gibberish in all the papers they send out to people. I don't know, maybe it's all done electronically now, but in the old days, like 5 years ago, it was still done, you know, health insurance forms and parking information and, you know, where to, you know, how, loft requirements, if you're putting a loft in your dorm room, how to get it inspected, and this vast quantity of papers. Somewhere in there, there's a voter registration form. And they would send out every year some number like 40 or 45,000 of those. And I think maybe 6 of them would come back filled out. See, you can do that. There's nothing wrong with that. Now that's how to do it wrong. See, you just, I always think, why do, my wisdom comes from places like this. Why do drunks sleep in the gutter? You have to ask yourself, why do they sleep in the gutter? Why don't they sleep at the top of the hill? Why do they sleep at the bottom? And the answer is, that's where you roll, right? If you just keep rolling, you'll end up in the gutter. You won't end up at the top of the hill where it's dry, okay? Well, if you conduct a voter registration drive, the way drunks roll, okay, you'll end up with a voter registration drive in which you ask people to volunteer. You don't pay them. You don't really supervise them. You don't really tell them what to say. And you wait for people to come up and fill out your forms. Okay, now that's the wrongest way I can think of doing it. Now the right way to do it is to have your people paid per registration, which by the way is one of the things that the Republicans tried to outlaw. Pay them per registration and then train them how to get people to register to vote, as if they're trying to sell something. This is like, the good old days with door-to-door salesmen trying to sell encyclopedias and Cutco knives and Tupperware and all these things that used to be sold door-to-door. So you have a spiel. And the spiel isn't about trying to convince people to change their lives and think differently. The spiel is to try to take what they already think and in just a few words box them in to registering. And so roughly it's things like, hi, are you so-and-so? Are you Jim Smith? I'm here for the Democratic Party. You're not registered to vote anywhere. And you have to register to vote by October 9th or you won't be eligible to vote in the election. And Jim Smith says, huh? What, you only have 6 more days to register to vote. Oh. And then he's showing the form. And you say, if all this information is right, all you have to do is sign there. And you hand him a pen. And he's thinking, he must know what I haven't registered, I guess I should, I could. And then you say to him, if you change your mind, you want to register to vote somewhere else, if you register to vote again, it'll cancel this one. You can say that to him. And that says to him, so I'm not even committing myself. No, if you want to register to vote back home, get back to Livonia and register to vote in the next 5 days. And at this point, you just get rid of you. He signs it. And you take it away. They say, they'll send you a new voter card in the mail. Thank you. And then you leave. And if you do that, you can get, I don't know, it depends on the year, you get 30, 40, 50, 60% of the people you approach to register. And I suppose, just like ordinary sales, if you're on a guy's floor and you've got good legs and you're female, you can get a few more. And if you're sort of a jerk and hostile and kind of vaguely menacing and you mumble, you'll probably get fewer. But if the people managing the drive send attractive women, this is sort of like, I'm using this as an example, I'm not really recommending this exactly, but you try to optimize the presentation of the people going out. You try to make them look normal. You don't send 80-year-olds with walkers door to door. Maybe you do, right? But you find people who are able to get a high percentage. You spread best practices among your voter registrars, so the ones who are successful help train the other ones and tell them, good tips. You understand there's some people that you can't register to vote, and they'll just argue with you. You lose all the arguments immediately. We've learned over the years, you don't profit by trying to argue with people. If you can't pick them up with a 2 or 3 sentence, you have to register to vote by such and such in order to vote in the election. All you have to do is sign a form. The city clerk will send you a voter card, and it'll tell you where to vote. And if all the information is right, all you have to do is sign it. If you do that, and maybe tune it up a little bit, you get about the highest percentage, the highest rate per hour per registrar. Now, I want to tell a little tiny story. I will leave his name out. But the registrar that convinced me of the perfection of this approach started with us when he was 12 years old. And at that time, we had all kinds of trouble getting at the MSU dorms because the dorm authorities were just very unsympathetic. But we could get this 12-year-old in, and everybody assumed he was somebody's little brother. He just looked like somebody's little brother. And he would go up and he'd start talking politics, and everybody was so puzzled by this and so surprised. I mean, they kept thinking they should like give him directions. He was lost, and he was wandering around Bryan Hall, and somebody, everybody would be willing to talk to him. He was a nice kid. And they would next find themselves listening to a very short political discussion, and they'd sign up, and he'd go away to the next room, and nobody ever hassled him, nobody ever slowed him down. Everybody took him more seriously than you'd ever expect. And this was back in about 1997, I guess. And he was making $20 or $25 an hour, $1 registration plus minimum wage. He was making a lot of money for a 12-year-old kid. And so he'd work 4 hours a night and take home $100. I haven't really looked at it. It's useless. Explain the law is there's this unenforceable thing which requires public universities, which receive federal money or something like that, to encourage or support or permit or something voter registration. It was passed when the Democrats controlled Congress, needless to say. And MSU obeys it by sending out, well, I guess at this point they probably send out, I don't know, it must be close to at least 500,000, maybe 1 million voter forms, of which maybe 100 have been filled out. It's been very useful. And they also encourage it by trying to tell us how to register voters, because they keep trying to correct our methods so that we will be like the drunk at the lowest point in the roadway. We will follow all their rules about setting up tables and not approaching people directly and not using lists and not knowing who we were talking to and, really respecting people's privacy and their right to, not register to vote. And anyway, so MSU does a great job of following federal law, and I think that's about what federal law is worth. It's a great tragedy that the Democratic Party in Michigan, probably other states too, but in Michigan in particular, rather than aggressively building a campaign and registering voters on all the university campuses in the state, instead of doing that, it limits itself to useless, vague, ineffective methods. I mean, aren't even methods. I mean, there is no voter drive that I know of at Central Michigan supported by the state Democratic Party. But the state Democratic Party would have a tremendous reason, it would be a tremendous benefit to the Democratic Party as people turn 18, particularly kids who are going to universities. Think about what a large fraction of all students or all the college-age kids there are who are at colleges, right? To identify them by party early on, to involve a lot of them in political activities, to keep track of who they are, and then as they graduate and they move around the state, they marry, they buy houses, they raise families, to have already ID'd them out there, and to have them inculcated with a sense that they're Democrats, that they're active in politics, that they always vote. And it wouldn't be hard to do, but it would require actually devoting some resources to something other than bloviation. And I'm afraid that at this point, and as far as I know, back to the beginning of the 18-year-old vote and the right of students to vote in their college towns, it was really about 1971. So beginning 42 years ago, the state Democratic Party has been entirely useless in this. If anything, the statistics seem to show that Republican students in college towns have a substantially higher percentage of applying for and returning absentee ballots to their parents' addresses than Democrats do. And that tells me that the Republicans, even though they're hostile to college students voting generally, manage to identify their supporters and to some extent manage to get them absentee ballots to get them to vote. So the Republican campaign has all sorts of disadvantages because it's not fundamentally their crowd, right? And yet, every election I see that of all the students who, for example, at MSU, who are registered to vote in Oakland County, the Democrats have at least a 10 percentage point lower rate of applying for a returning absentee ballot than the Republicans have. And so I'd say that the Democrats are completely ineffective at registering, turning out voters, identifying their voters, and working college campuses, even though it's a natural constituency, and even though if they had worked that, it would have had tremendous effects in a number of very close statewide races. But they basically squandered that, and they, as far as I know, continue to squander it.